Good morning. Good morning. Somebody's waving. That's great. For those of you who don't know, my name is Tom Foley. I'm now a sophomore at Mount Aloysius. Just about. I'm delighted to welcome you to our second inaugural symposium entitled The University's Role in Civil Discourse. I have two very brief functions here today. One, to answer quickly the question, why this topic? And secondly, to introduce you to our moderator. First assignment, why civil discourse? The notion of civil discourse traces back to the Roman concept of societas civilis, which was the belief that one's conduct in the public realm towards others should seek to always promote the good of the city, of the state, the good of the whole. The idea then was that democracy, at its best, is a conversation, a civil conversation about the laws that govern and the values that define. Each of our panelists has written powerfully on a different aspect of civil discourse in academia and life, civil discourse in public life, civil discourse in a global environment, and civil discourse in an internet age. And so far as I can tell, they're fairly united in their views in at least three respects. First, that the notion of what constitutes civil discourse has become immeasurably more complex than when the Romans first sought to define it. Second, that there's been, if not a decline, certainly a dramatic change in what we regard as civil behavior by any definition and across communication channels, and I mean both traditional and social medias. And thirdly, that higher education, the university in our title, has a role to play in both defining civil discourse, the first issue, and in improving it, the second issue. And I'm very anxious for one to hear this conversation. So let's get to it. Let me introduce our moderator. Sandra Myers has focused on two themes in her professional life: the integration of culture into public policy and the strengthening of democracy and the culture of interdependence worldwide. She has lectured at dozens of colleges and universities in the United States and around the world, is the editor of a number of books on the intersection of democracy, religion, culture, and prosperity, and is currently the Senior Fellow for International Civic and Cultural Projects at the University of Scranton. Sandra is a past chair of the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, the past president of the National Federation of States Humanities Councils, and the recipient of the Connecticut College Medal, which is the highest honor bestowed on an alum of her college. She served 7 years as the cultural advisor to Governor Robert P. Casey, which is where I first met her, and during which she convened a wide-ranging series of seminars on matters of public policy, culture, and education, and she holds an honorary degree from our sister school at Misericordia. Sandra Myers.
Tom promised not to say too much, but it was a little too much, but thank you, Tom. It speaks volumes to those of you assembled here to celebrate the inauguration of Tom Foley as president of Mount Aloysius College, that he has chosen civility and civic discourse as the focus of this auspicious occasion. Civility, in this instance, is not good manners, which are also important, but rather civility is a necessary ingredient in a pluralistic democratic society. Civility and civic discourse are defining features in a society of others, of people from any number of cultures, countries, ethnicities, who believe profoundly that government must be of, for, and by the people. We are neither a family nor a tribe. We must be carefully taught to go beyond tribalism. Even, this usually irks people, even beyond family values, beyond provincialism, beyond xenophobia. In a certain way, it is something of a higher calling to be an American citizen. Our master, our ruler, if you will, is the law, the Constitution, recalling that we observe Constitution Day tomorrow, September 17th. And what Yale Law professor Akhil Amar calls the unwritten Constitution, those laws, customs, and iconic leaders and events that articulate the hopes and dreams and the progress of our society, that help us all to be all that we might be. We know by experience that this nation is still a kind of experiment. Every day we wonder, can we really live together civically, creatively, and compassionately? I think we Americans need to understand better how important that is to us individually and collectively, and why we must not take for granted that this is business as usual around the world. I hope that our discussion will be an incentive to all of us to think about this matter more deeply than before and recognize it as important to the very existence of our nation. Indeed, knowing how important this idea is to your president, Tom Foley, I feel confident that students at Mount Aloysius College will know when they leave here that whatever else they've studied, whatever profession or career path they choose, they are first and foremost citizens of their communities, of the United States, if that's the case, and of the world. As the late Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis observed, the most important office in our democracy is that of private citizen. I propose that that be etched in the minds of students, faculty, and administrators at Mount Aloysius, and even perhaps engraved on one of your fine buildings. And while we're in the etching and engraving mood, let me propose another thought, one that comes to me frequently as I travel in the developing world. And that is that in the realm of rights and responsibilities, and you know we take our rights very seriously here, and we should be taking our responsibilities very seriously, the most precious right an individual can have is the right to be responsible for the public good. It's a very rare thing in this world. We Americans can't begin to know how rare it is, but we should think about that. Today, our main task is to ponder what higher education in general, and Mount Aloysius in particular, can and will do in its curriculum and in its co-curricular and extracurricular programs to foster a civil society in this institution that will stand as a microcosm of a just and democratic society and to prepare its students for the civic life. It's a big order, but to borrow a compelling thought from a distinguished Jesuit educator, I work at a Jesuit institution, the real challenge of our universities lies in who our students become. That said, let me introduce the distinguished members of the panel to you and proceed with the symposium. After we have engaged in discussion among us, we will open the questions to all of you, and we look forward to your questions, comments, challenges, whatever you may like to do. Dr. John Murray is Chancellor and Professor of Law at Duquesne University. Dr. David Shribman is Executive Editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and the Honorable D. Brooke Smith is a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. We'll begin with Mr. Shribman. I'm going to walk over and sit with these gentlemen.
Would you like us to offer some introductory remarks?
I'm going to...
Oh, ask you a question, okay.
I'm going to ask you a question.
All right.
This is for Mr. Shribman. In recent times, our politics has been deluged with examples of the blame game, which could be regarded as not only uncivil but unproductive. Presumably, democracy, no matter how contentious a system it is meant to come up with decisions that benefit the people. In your view, do we need to rescue our politics from its uncivil descent into the blame game? Is it possible, and is it even desirable?
Well, I'm not sure that the blame game was invented in our time or in your time or even in ours. And in my time covering Congress and the White House and in Washington, there was plenty of blame given, and in truth, plenty of blame deserved. But I was thinking just this week, when we were talking about Social Security, about the difference in Washington and the difference in the debate, even compared with two very contentious times. 1935, which was the middle of the New Deal period, and still the back end of the Depression, in 1965, which was the backwash from the Kennedy administration, Kennedy assassination, and the beginning of the Great Society. In 1935, the president proposed and Congress passed the Social Security Act, which had bipartisan support. I believe 24 or more Republicans voted for the Social Security Act, the very Social Security that Governor Perry spoke about last week or two, speaking about it being a Ponzi scheme. In 1965, there was robust bipartisan support for Medicare, which was the most dramatic extension of government into the lives of people in our time. When we look at the Obama health plan, which is said to be the third step in that progression, Social Security, Medicare, Obamacare, not one Republican voted for, in the House or the Senate, voted for that bill. Now, I'm not chastising Republicans or celebrating Democrats. I'm a member of neither party. But I do think that's a signal change. But as we look at that change, let's remember one other thing, which has got to which I think is at the heart of our civility crisis now. And as a political scientist, you probably recognize this, that in the 30s and in the 60s, and up until the 80s, we did not have what political scientists in this country have dearly wanted us to have for several generations, and that was parties of ideological purity. And people sat in the academy and elsewhere and said, oh, the thing that's wrong with American democracy is that our parties aren't pure. We have liberal Democrats and conservative Democrats, and liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. Well, we got what everybody was wishing for. And I think the result, when you have a party that's a conservative party, which the Republican Party now quite obviously is, and a liberal party, which the Democratic Party is unquestionably, that you're going to have a less civil discourse. And I think the fault may not be in ourselves, but in our parties and the way they're structured. And I personally regret the passing of liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats and feel that we're poorer for it, and that's one of the reasons for our lack of civility in our civic discourse.
Would you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, in the old days, which is to say when we were young, you know, I have this theory that it doesn't matter how old you are, what really matters is when you were young. And think about that. It's not, but the Democratic Party is a very good example in which there was a southern rump of the Democratic Party that was deeply conservative, that still retained states' rights identity and fumes of the Civil War. It was racist or nearly racist, but it was very, very powerful part of the Democratic Party until the Johnson years. And it was very difficult for liberal legislation to be passed by Democratic presidents because they were opposed by the members of their own party. But they had as allies liberal Republicans. And I don't think, for example, in the Roosevelt years, there was any more vicious fight than there was between President Roosevelt and I think the '38 election and the conservatives he tried to purge from his own party. President Johnson knew that he could not pass the Civil Rights Bill of 1965 without Republican votes. In fact, I believe the percentage of votes that supported the Civil Rights Bill in the Senate was higher in the Republican Party than it was in the Democratic Party. That promoted a sense of civility, and even though we were talking about the most uncivil acts in American history, it promoted a sense of civility and bipartisanship that we don't have today. The most conservative member of the Democratic Party is more liberal than the most liberal member of the Republican Party today. That was not true as recently as 25 years ago.
Thank you. Dr. Murray, in your opinion piece in the Post-Gazette of January 18th, you spoke of the need for civility and the need for virtue in our citizens. Yet we know that all people, educated or not, are not virtuous, and just about none of us are virtuous all the time. What can we in higher education do in an increasingly interdependent world to graduate students who have a strong sense of virtue and at the same time a strong sense of respect for those whose views of virtue might be different from theirs?
I think when you're 18 years old, the most important conversation you can have is about the eternal questions. Who am I? How shall I live? What is my purpose? And you can talk about this in high philosophical terms, but you can talk about it also in terms of practical realities from day to day. I think that we have not remembered what we should have learned from Aristotle, or from Augustine, or from Thomas Aquinas, or all three in particular. I think when we talk about the virtuous life, we're talking about the cardinal virtues. We're talking about prudence and justice. The judge can tell you how difficult it is to define justice, as we all know. But nonetheless, we recognize it as a virtue. Moderation, we used to call it temperance. Fortitude, courage, real courage, not false courage, not macho courage. And then, of course, the supernatural virtues of faith and hope and love. That sounds rather ephemeral today, but the fact of the matter is, to reduce these concepts to everything we do in life, the only life worth living, I think, is the virtuous life. We've forgotten that. When this country was founded, notwithstanding incredible debates among our founding fathers, with some name-calling that would rival some of the name-calling of today, they all agreed upon one concept. And the concept was very simply this: we cannot have a republic unless you have virtuous citizenry. When Franklin exited the Constitutional Convention, someone said to him, Mr. Franklin, what do we have? Do we have a monarchy? Do we have a republic? And he said, we have a republic if you can keep it, which I think says it all. Now, we can talk about, Madison said, you cannot have the society that we have created unless you depend upon virtuous citizens, because they are now the boss. They are in charge. It's not the monarch who's in charge any longer. So when we talk about virtue, we used to talk about civic virtue. We used to talk about being able to say, have an extremely important discussion, argument, if you will, advocate our position, you advocate your position, and at the same time, not resort to ad hominem comments, not resort to name calling, not take the position that I hate the other party because they don't agree with me. And I think the strong ideological positions that David's referring to today are a manifestation of the fact that we don't understand the virtuous life.
Well, I agree. I think that the public and civic part is so important, because some people, that's why I say, partly with tongue-in-cheek, we have to get over family values. Yes, we don't have to get over them, but we have to get beyond them. And one of the simplest iterations of that I've heard was, I was at a dinner of the Salvation Army last December, and they told a story of their founder, who was in England at Christmas time. He was very poor, and he wanted to send a message to all of his constituents, fellow Salvation Army corps. And he could only afford one word, and the word was others. And it really speaks to the civic life, and civic virtue, because so much in our life, so much that we can do, is have a respectful and constructive and compassionate relationship with others. And we know many more others in the world today than we knew then. But it's something that has inspired me. And now I'll turn to Judge Smith. With your permission, let me ask two questions to you in public that you have asked yourself, as they reflect the complexities and dilemmas that the law itself poses. How do we uphold our commitment to free speech and still shield the most vulnerable among us? Should those of us upholding these rights be concerned that our decisions may appear to be condoning uncivil words and actions? Not an easy question.
As a judge, I find myself in a position quite frequently of addressing the assertion of constitutional rights. And as a rights-based democratic society, there is a very, very significant dose, a healthy dose, of individualism in that. We celebrate individuality in our culture, and it's certainly ingrained in our Constitution. I've found myself in the position as a member of an appellate court where I have had to make decisions, vote on cases on a 3-judge panel, where we were determining the constitutionality of such things as university speech codes, which of course are often a subject of controversy on the campus itself, and which have provided to many courts some very difficult and profound questions of constitutional proportion. And I've recently had to deal with several cases involving the assertion of constitutional rights of public school students who have chosen, and I emphasize chosen, to say some very uncivil things about teachers and principals on through such media as Facebook. What do we do about extremely uncivil expressions by students when they have been uttered in places which are not on or a part of the school campus and are not projected onto the school campus, but which, as we all know, given the ubiquitous nature of electronic communication, are available to everyone? My conclusion, and the very, very brief and perhaps to some of you pessimistic message that I have to convey after thinking about this in anticipation of this program, is don't look for a great deal of help from the courts. I mean, we are here as the protectors of individual rights. We're here as the protectors of a very robust free speech jurisprudence in this country. And it means that we have accepted from the adoption of the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment, and I think that it is not an accident that that amendment had primacy in its adoption, that individuals would be free to say things that often were not particularly hospitable to particular audiences. Now, courts are grappling today, courts are trying to figure out how we address the ubiquitous nature I referred to of electronic communication, the ability to spread messages quickly and to huge audiences, and the fact that that this is all being done without regulation. And courts are called upon from time to time, as they were in the cases that I briefly referenced, because school districts chose to discipline students through a formal disciplinary process, which is the use of the power of the state to try to control what students had said. And our court, in several cases, stated quite clearly that this constituted a violation of those students' First Amendment rights. So Courts have been looked to, as I think everyone here knows, more and more in the last several generations to sometimes seek to solve our problems, but we are not some brooding omnipresence in the sky that is able to come down and solve all your problems. We are not some deus ex machina that's brought onto the stage at a point of emergency and can provide great wisdom to solve every human problem. And so don't expect in an age of increasing incivility to see the courts be able to prescribe a means by which discourse can be made more civil, more hospitable to every audience. If it's going to happen anywhere, and God knows it has not been happening of late or for some time in the political arena, it is here. It is on the campus. It is through instruction. It is through the kind of tension, of rubbing of elbows with your fellows and with those who maybe don't share a great deal in common with you, that you develop an understanding and appreciation of others' views. The culture of the campus, the culture of the university can, I think, contribute to that in ways that courts will fail woefully in accomplishing.
How about the culture of the media, Mr. Sherman? Do you find that is a factor here?
Well, the culture and character of the media has changed substantially, as it always does. As you know, and as Dr. Murray mentioned earlier, that we used to have highly partisan press, and then we got into a period beginning really around the end of the Depression and beginning of World War II, a professionalized press that was less partisan and more or less biased. And we're now going into a period of more contention and with a democratization of the press. And none of you students have ever read a newspaper, but newspapers used to be, and still are to a great extent, seek to be fair and if not objective. And we have a whole new crop of media that don't ascribe to that notion at all and are elements of advocacy. If I could I use my time to amplify something that Dr. Murray said, which I thought was quite profound. I hope you listen carefully to what Dr. Murray said, because I agree too that the years between 18 and 22 are the only times you will have the leisure and the discipline, combination of the two, to be able to examine the great questions. And I think one of the great questions our time is presenting us with, and it's one that presents itself from time to time throughout time, is what is the nature and character of compromise? Now, I've been wrestling with this question myself recently. Should politicians compromise? President Kennedy wrote a book before he was president called Profiles in Courage, which I really recommend to all of you. It's an enduring book, and it talks about people of great courage. And half of those people compromised with their foes, and half of those people stood up to their foes and said, I will not compromise. And it makes me wonder whether Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, who compromised, would today be reviled figures. Is it a virtue to compromise, or is it a virtue to hold firm to your principles? Did Webster do the country a disservice by shepherding through the compromise of 1850? He was reviled for it at his death in 1853. Should we compromise on the budget? Should the Democrats compromise on spending? And should the Republicans compromise on taxes? And are they true to them can they be true to themselves by not being true to their country, or the other way around? And I'm wondering whether it's possible for you to wrestle with this question, as we are as a civic society, about what is the nature and virtue of compromise. And should compromise be celebrated, or should it be reviled? And do we need, and are there times when there are compromises that must be made, and are there times when there are compromises that must not be made? Did Clay and Webster make compromises on the ultimate moral issue facing this country, which was slavery? And in fact, were Garrison and the abolitionists more pure? And I think this is a question that's very, very difficult. It's a good final exam question for a 19th century American history course. And it's a good final exam for all of us as we examine the nature of our polity.
As a judge, I'm not permitted to have an opinion on politics. And given current events, most of the time I would prefer not to have an opinion of a political nature. But my response to your inquiry would be, of course compromise is a virtue.
See, I can argue
compromise is a good thing.
But should we compromise on abortion? Should we compromise on slavery? Should we compromise on taxes? Where's the line? How do you make that decision?
We might not have had a constitution if we didn't compromise on slavery, alas.
Correct. We didn't compromise on where the capital was going to be on that great dinner.
But it does seem to me, as a distant observer, that the current political order has a very, very significant element of no compromise, and the view that no compromise is a virtue. It is impossible for me to imagine participation, especially as a decision maker, in a pluralistic society without the notion of compromise being a very significant aspect of your means of doing business.
But if I could ask our moderator, should they have compromised at Munich in 1938? Should there have been a compromise at the Holocaust? I mean, these are very hard questions.
Well, they are, but it means that there's nothing absolute about compromise, the nature of it or the occasion for it. So some compromises had deadly results. Mm-hmm. Well, we say, and I don't even know if we call them compromise. But I think that politics is almost defined by compromise. What worries me about the present situation, that it is a non-politics, and it's absolutism and holding your ground right or wrong, or holding your ground no matter what the consequences for the society, I think is dangerous.
There's a wonderful story, then I'll yield the floor to my colleagues, involving Tip O'Neill. When he calls in a young congressman, and there's some vote on some issue, I don't even remember what it was, and he says to young Congressman Murray, John, I really need your vote on this. And Congressman Murray, still starry-eyed, looks up at the speaker and says, well, Mr. Speaker, you know, I'm with you when you're right. And the speaker says, John, when I'm right, I don't need you.
Dr. Murray, would you like to say something about this? And then we're soon you be thinking about these questions. You notice we're asking you questions.
When I think of compromise, I think of a concept called agreement. I teach contract law, and I think we make contracts with each other all the time, some of which are legally enforceable, but many agreements are not legally enforceable. I think there's compromise between friends, between spouses, there are compromises in families, there are compromises that are made daily. I think the question is, from whence does the compromise arise? Does it rise out of rational thought? Does it arise out of a sense of, let's try to solve this problem together? I have a solution, you have a solution, etc. There are different solutions. If both solutions are within the Aristotelian zone of reasonableness, then there isn't much argument. But the fact of the matter is, instead of thinking rationally, and this is the other problem, I think, with what's happening in our society, we don't care about rational thought anymore. It's not a question of solving the problem. It's a question of winning. I'm going to win the argument regardless.
What if the compromise is about money? What if the compromise is primarily about nothing more than money? I remember reading, when I was a student, a wonderful little book by a British political scientist by the name of Bernard Crick, who recounted a story of a citizen asking Abraham Lincoln why he looked so sad and so wise. And his response was, because I've learned I can't have everything I want in life. And this story was offered to suggest that in that recognition really is the beginning of all wisdom in life and how we go about living life. Now, if our major questions which call for compromise are about nothing but money, and people's focus is largely one of green eye shades, and we still can't reach compromise, that suggests to me that we have reached a point where, as a civil society, we're not agreeing on much of anything.
But I think that's right. There are certain kinds of questions, however, going back to Munich, for example, and was Chamberlain right in trying to compromise at that time? Was Chamberlain doing the right thing? It seems to me you've got to be talking about what values are there. If you're talking about money, that's one thing. If you're talking about tyranny, first of all, you have to be able to recognize it. And secondly, I don't think there is any compromise with tyranny. So it really, as we say in the law, Judge, it always depends upon all of the surrounding circumstances.
Well, you mentioned it's about winning, Dr. Murray, and well, what is winning? If you're in a pluralistic democracy, if you presumably care about or are obliged to care about the public good, what is winning? You know, I think we have opposite sides thinking what winning is. Is health care for more people losing for some people? Does that mean, is that a loss for some people? Well, for many, it's definitely clearly a win. And it gets a little bit sad when we can't compromise on, not a little bit sad, tragically sad if we can't compromise on things. With the thought in mind that we are responsible for the public good. We have private rights that we cherish and we should cherish. They're valuable. But as I said earlier, I think are the most important right we have in a society, if we care about society, to have responsibility for the public good.
Now, I'll go back to something Judge Smith said. If we're fighting about money, then you can compromise pretty easily. But what if one side thinks the fight about money is really a proxy for a fight about freedom, and the other side thinks the fight about money is really a proxy for a fight about compassion and responsibility? And that's where we are now. I think we are at one of the most fundamental junctures of our history when we are, and it's not the first time we've been there, we'll be there again, when we are examining the clash between compassion and freedom, responsibility and individuality. We had this, that was what the 1932 election was about. That was the 1980 election was about that. The 2008 election was about that. The 1912 election was about that. We fight about this all the time because this is the ultimate American question. Responsibility versus individuality, compassion versus freedom, etc. These are eternal values which in the classroom and sometimes in symposiums like that are easy to define and defend. But in the arena, as President Roosevelt said, Teddy Roosevelt, these get muddled, and each side believes that winning is good for America because their idea is better than the other guy's idea. And we're at one of those clashes right now. It's a fundamental clash. Historically, you're watching something very important, this clash between freedom and responsibility.
Would you like to say something, and then we're going to open it up to the audience?
Yeah, I'd like to say something about freedom. I think freedom is a sacred gift. I think we take it for granted as Americans.
Yeah.
And it really is the most wonderful gift we can have in many ways. But I'd say we also forget that freedom is a means and not an end. There is freedom to speak. And the question is, Freedom to do what? To speak that way? The courts are not going to be able to deal with that. Rather, it has to come from the individual. And the individual isn't going to know freedom to do what. No, there's no answer to that question unless you really have a sense of responsibility, unless you really have some sense of what Madison called a virtuous life.
Well, what do you think about compromise, and what do you think about freedom, and do you have questions for us?
The nature of the question really goes to the extent to which the courts must adapt to changes in technology, and whether or not there have been, and we can anticipate, increased litigation results from the use of social media and the expansion of electronic media generally. And we've already seen that. And a point I did not make earlier, and probably bears stating, but it wasn't particularly relevant at the time to the point I wanted to make. Obviously, the courts are called upon and must respond appropriately where they're presented with cases involving behavior that is clearly unlawful, that is clearly criminal. One of the great horrors, and I would not use that word lightly, but one of the great horrors to me, post-internet, has been to see the considerable extent of activity that goes on the internet involving child porn, and to see, as I have seen on criminal dockets, the prosecutions of people who have done just completely inhumane things that in my life experience are sometimes just completely unimaginable. Courts have responded, the prosecutorial arm of governments have responded, mostly at the federal level because it implicates interstate commerce, but state governments and state prosecutorial arms have done that as well. So when I have indicated don't look to the courts for help, I'm certainly not talking about that kind of activity, which is clearly criminal and which is appropriately sanctioned and which we deal with on an ongoing basis. The difficulties are the cases that fall within the areas of uncivil, but nonetheless perfectly legitimate discourse, which is and must be constitutionally acceptable in a society that believes in a robust free speech doctrine and jurisprudence. And people often expect courts to be able to sort those cases out, and it's difficult to do that without finding yourself in the business of regulating speech, and that's what government should not be doing. So the law moves slowly, just as the church often moves very slowly. We make changes residually. One asks, is the explosion of electronic media something that ought to change the law exponentially? And I think not. I think most of our basic principles, at least our constitutional principles, are going to remain as they are, and we'll find a way to adapt and to handle these things. But in the end, most of that is going to be dealt with through the democratic process and the political process. Don't look to the courts to set down rules that may regulate speech.
Yes.
I have the opposite question. And my opposite question. Hi. My opposite question is this. Did we ask the wrong question? Is the discourse really not that uncivil? Prior to the Civil War, a Southern congressman literally beat up a senator on the floor of the United States Senate. That was clearly not civil. There was a civil war. In the 40s and in the 50s, this great period of quote-unquote compromise, the House Un-American Activities Committee was putting people, ruining careers, simply as a consequence of some perceived affiliation or identification with communism in a country where that really had no chance of ever succeeding. Is the discourse that we see right now simply a reflection of the fact that we live in a very competitive political environment where there are equal numbers really on both sides of the aisle, and we're talking about fundamentally contentious issues? The issue that Mr. Shribman pointed out about healthcare, is it a right or is it a commodity? Aren't these just difficult issues to debate? And ought we not just to debate them and not worry so much about good manners?
Well, does either of you would like to address that?
Well, you look back on the caning of Senator Sumner of Massachusetts, and that was we can agree, a distinctly uncivil act. The spitting of Congressman Lyon in the House in the 19th century. Those are acts of violence seen in hockey rinks and in street corners, but rarely in the civic discourse. We are now examining, and we always do this. I mean, the Goldwater-Johnson election was about fundamental questions. You know, the Bush-Gore, before it got to the court, was about nothing. I think the 2012 election will be about something quite substantial. Democracy is messy. Now, we've talked about the Civil War a couple times, and I think, you know, we all agree that Lincoln was a great leader and that Lincoln saved the Union and freed the slaves. And he said in his second inaugural he wondered whether all of the blood that had been drawn by the lash would have to be answered by blood drawn by the sword. But nonetheless, Lincoln's a great hero of us, but he was a civil libertarian disaster, right? President Wilson had all this great rhetoric about freedom and the 14 points and open covenants openly arrived at, and his civil liberties record was repugnant, and his civil rights record was even worse. And so I think we have to realize that presidents are human. They have lots of faults and frailties, and every period that reflects those presidents is full of contradiction and contention. We think of the Kennedy period, 1961 to 63, as 1,000 days of idealism, and yet the president resisted Martin Luther King at every stop until he could basically resist him no more. And so this is a messy, messy, messy system because we deal in this country with big, big, big questions. And maybe that's the answer about civility. Maybe there are periods of incivility, as long as they don't become Charles Sumner moments, when things have to get a little bit nasty. I kind of don't like it. I don't like it at all. But we are wrestling with big questions that were not wrestled with between 1933 and 1945 in Germany, that were not wrestled with between 1917 and 1989 in the Soviet Union, that were not wrestled. We can go through every tyranny in history. We wrestle with big issues mostly in a civil way, and there is flaring of incivility. I know I'm getting off the script here because we're supposed to be deploring incivility, and I deplore it too, but sometimes maybe you have to have a little bit of it.
David, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question, which is suggested both by the profound historical contexts that you've been able to offer, but also by the previous question, which suggested that maybe we were discussing the wrong question. We've been talking about uncivil discourse to a great extent, And I look back to some history that I know when I was a student, which was the last century, and I happened to do...
He could have said that in 1999 too, probably.
I did an internship as a college student for the then minority leader of the United States Senate, Hugh Scott. Mm-hmm. Now, at that time, Hugh Scott, who was minority leader, Republican leader, and Mike Mansfield, who was the Democratic leader, the majority leader, liked each other. And they were friends, and they shared some mutual interests. They both liked Chinese art, for example. But they had a regular practice, a weekly practice, and I think it was Tuesday afternoon. They would get together at the end of the day, the two leaders, and they'd sit and have a drink, and they'd talk. We've been talking about uncivil discourse, but there's another question I think we might also be discussing, and that is the extent to which we're not talking. Can anyone imagine Mitch McConnell and Harry Reid getting together for a drink at the end of the day? And is it because of them, or is it because of all of us, and their bases just won't allow it?
I want to just answer that briefly if I can. You know, that story about Hugh Scott and Mike Mansfield has a House analog, as you know. Bob Michael and Tip O'Neill. But I would argue that for all the surface conviviality and the talk about the Ming Dynasty vases in the Senate and golf in the House, that the Republicans in that period were held in servile slavery by the Democrats. And from 1954 to 1994 in the House, and with some exceptions in the Senate, the Democrats ruled with tyranny and cruelty over the Republicans, and while there was a surface comedy, it was a profound political tyranny. And I know I'm supposed to be the editor of the liberal newspaper, but I covered that period, and it was a period, as you remember, where Republican amendments were given no chance, and in the House, not even a vote. And it was a period where can I say this at Mount Aloysius College, where if you pissed off the Democratic leadership in the House, they turned your air conditioning off. And so that was surface civility, but it was profound servility, I think.
Well, I'd like to continue that a bit because I think about this isn't hidden hostility and incivility. Is it politics? I won't even say is it civil. Is it politics if one party proclaims without question, they promise not to cooperate or collaborate or compromise? That seems to be like an end of politics rather than a civility question, or civility in a larger public sense.
I remember speaking of what may be called fictitious compromise or fictitious friendship, a television program called The Evan Charlie Show. Everett Dirksen and Charlie Halleck, who came on television and were friendly on television, but I don't think they were that friendly in reality.
No, but you know, in all of my comments, Judge Smith is right about a fundamental thing, is that they don't even talk to each other now. And I was stunned in my last years covering in Washington that Speaker Gingrich and Congressman Gephardt, who was the House Minority Leader, never once had a meal together. And that can't be good.
To reduce this to something I tried to say earlier, it seems to me that one of the problems is the philosophy of our time. And the great ethicist Alistair McIntyre talks about the philosophy of the late 20th and now 21st century, which is emotivism. I spent some time in Philadelphia not too many years ago, and at that time they had a couple of radio programs involving psychologists. You would call in with your question, and the psychologist would give you an answer. And I remember one question was from a woman who called in and said, I haven't spoken to my mother in 3 years, and I wonder if I should send her a Mother's Day card. And the psychologist answered, how do you feel about that? Whatever makes you comfortable, you should do, he said. And I thought to myself that was an extremely good illustration of emotivism. Emotivism has nothing to do with rational argument, rational thought. It has nothing to do with, should we have universal health care? Should we have health care for people who can't afford health care? If the answer to that is no, I have no understanding of that answer. So it's not a question of whether we should have it. It's a question of how do we get there from here? And that's been, we have been spinning our wheels in that area because somebody has to win that game instead of talking about let's get it done.
Society winning the game.
That's right.
Are there any more questions? Yes? You and then you.
In teaching ethics and healthcare ethics especially, in terms of contemporary debates in healthcare ethics, something I repeat over and over is reasonable people can disagree. But I think it presupposes that reasonable people have respect for one another. And I just wondered if anyone would like to comment upon how current ideologies might be precluding the possibility of reasonable people disagreeing. Thank you.
Very briefly, I would say, and ask my colleagues to tell me I'm wrong. The most virtuous statement I think a politician could make at this time would be, we have an obligation to look out for each other. And if we don't believe that, then this democracy isn't worth anything.
I remember when I was a student with President Foley at Dartmouth College in the 70s, the president of Dartmouth at the time was a Hungarian refugee named John Kemeny. And he used to close convocation, which occurs next week at Dartmouth, with the same comment. He says, the question is not, am I my brother's keeper? The question is whether you're your brother's brother. And that's a very profound question. And I think that gets to the heart of what we're saying. The goal shouldn't be winning the debate, it should be winning for America, and or for the world, or for whatever. I think that we've lost sight of that, and you do that sometimes in times of high contention, but it's the main game here, and I think Dr. Murray is right.
Yeah, if that public good, if others, if our brothers and sisters aren't that, and it, you know, that maybe sounds a little too romantic and love. It, you know, as Martin Luther King once said in one of his less popular or quoted speeches, we're not asking them to love us, just get off our backs. Well, he wanted more than getting off their backs, but it isn't, there's something about a civic obligation in a pluralistic democratic society, and if that doesn't operate, if that's not in the equation, then there are no standards of civility. This is the ultimate civility, to understand that we're responsible for public good, it seems to me. There's a question there.
Through the whole conversation, how do you bridge the gap between family and civil discourse? I mean, I believe it all starts with your family life. And if you can't bridge that gap with family, then how are you going to propose that your children are going to go out and be better citizens if there's no one to back you and say, you know, this is where the line's drawn? You know, Judge had mentioned about the law protecting you with the speech, that where's that fine line? How do you bridge the gap between the two?
Well, I don't know that it's a gap. I sometimes boldly say, well, I don't care about your family values. I care about how you treat others who aren't your family or friends. It's not, you know, when we're talking about civil behavior, civil discourse, civility, civil society, we are not talking about family values. It doesn't preclude or dismiss family values, but I think this is a conversation about how we get along as a society. What kind of society are we, and what kind of society do we aspire to be? And that is the realm where I think we deal with civil behavior rather than family behavior. You may have different views. We're getting close to ending time, and I would like to ask one more question of the panel and ask you either to respond to that or have your own last word, whatever it is. It is this: what can higher education do? What can Mount Aloysius do, or any other university or college do, not only to encourage civic discourse and upholding civility as a necessary component in a democratic society, but also in awakening students to giving them the will as well as the skills to be citizens of the world and of their own communities when they leave here?
I think that's actually the easiest question of all.
Okay.
And that is that, and I know you do this at this college, is to examine the central questions that Dr. Murray spoke about. And that you're here not only to be trained, but to be educated. And that to be educated is to know, as it was said in the 19th century, to be exposed to the best that was said and thought. And the best that was said and thought almost always engages the central questions: what is freedom? What is an individual? As Dr. Murray said, who am I? What is my purpose here? You should examine all those questions, and that given that I have 10 more years of college tuition to pay for myself, for my own children, I'd urge you to read a good newspaper every day also.
Any suggestions?
Call 1-800-POST-GAZETTE.
Dr. Murray.
I'd like to talk about the great conversation that should occur for all of us at all times, but particularly the college years. I think it's a wonderful time to talk about something that's very important. You go to school hopefully to be able to do something with the rest of your life that you enjoy doing and make a living at the same time and take care of yourself and your family. But I hope you also go to college for something that's even more important. That's an education for life. And again, the conversation does involve the eternal questions, the great questions. Because I think in the end, that's what every one of us has to face. The reality is that we have to do this from the individual. And hopefully we can attract others to a point of view to be open to ideas, to be open to the great challenges of life. But again, what is the purpose of all of this? Why are we here? If you believe that everything is simply a matter of opinion, then there is no vice because there is no virtue. There can't be anything wrong if you can't decide what is right. You can't have justice if you don't recognize manifest injustice when you see it. So my feeling is that every college and every university has this obligation. The courts can't do it for us. The old story about, well, if you don't like something, make it a law. The answer is that doesn't work. It has to come from family. It has to come from you as an individual. And in the end, I believe in education, not only for the mind, but for the heart and the soul.
Mr. Schriven and Dr. Murray have provided responses at a much loftier philosophical level than I'm about to. And I agree completely that this is an opportunity for you students in these several years to engage in self-examination and inquiries that you've not engaged in heretofore, and to ask yourselves questions of being, questions of an ontological nature, questions of an ethical nature. I would be a little bit more nuts and bolts in a suggestion that is hardly original and hardly lofty, but I think necessary just the same. And after now about 27 years in public life, in a number of positions as a judge, and prior to that as a district attorney, I am appalled often at how little our citizenry knows about just the basic structures, institutional, definitional structures of its government, of our government, and the levels of our government, and the responsibilities of the branches of our government. I know responsible citizens, even those citizens I've encountered whom I would say are educated citizens in many respects, who think I work for the Attorney General of the United States rather than as a member of a wholly independent branch of government. So while Mr. Sherman asked you to read a newspaper, and I think that's great advice, I will selfishly ask you to learn a little bit about the judiciary and its role in securing rights, and its role vis-a-vis the two political branches of government, because they're very, very different, not only in what they do, but in how they do it. I, with one final comment, want to thank your president, Tom Foley. Sandra said at the outset that it speaks volumes about him that he selected this topic for a symposium, and I had thought those very words, that very expression as I drove up here. It does indeed, that we're having a symposium here that is not about him on his inauguration as a president of this institution, but we're having a very important discussion about who we are and who we will be as a citizenry, and what your role is going to be in that citizenry, and what you will derive from your experience here at Mount Aloysius that will shape you as being a part of that citizenry. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to, before thanking you all for listening and participating, I'd like to take Tom on, now that I've said how comfortable I feel that he is passionate about civil society and civility. I would ask that you extend that. We ask, what can higher education do? Higher education and its administration and faculty can really explore the opportunities to integrate into your curricular and extracurricular and co-curricular life, but particularly curricular, some aspect of what civicness means in terms of you as a person as you graduate from here, and what they can do to instill to teach you that part of what you do and part of what you are in a democratic society is a citizen, and to impress on you, inspire you with a will, and teach you the skills to do that. Thank you.
Just 3 3 quick closing assignments here. First of all, thank you to this panel. I think we all recognize the extraordinary and at the same time intimate level of conversation that we just witnessed it. We talked about the notion of privacy, the right of free speech versus the right not to be violated by harmful speech. That's a big topic. We talked about freedom. The freedom, for example, not to have to listen to the blaring music of the person who lives next door to you versus responsibility. And is it a government responsibility? Is it a nonprofit responsibility? Is it a school responsibility? Is it our responsibility? A huge topic. We talked about the notion and the nature of compromise. What is it? When is it appropriate? Where are the no-go zones on compromise? And I think most importantly, we talked about the primacy of fundamental virtues. The primacy of fundamental virtues. It's not an accident that we chose this topic, and we chose the topic that we began these seminars with yesterday, which was the university's role in the social fabric. Because in our mission statement, we say that we want to synthesize faith with learning. We want to develop competence with compassion so that we can use our gifts at the service of others. And these topics on civil discourse and on the social fabric go directly to what is the mission of our institution. To Sandra's very important question, the challenge to us about what does it mean to be a citizen. We've begun down that road. Michael Jones, I think, is here today. Our dean and our humanities division, Deanne D'Amelio, we have worked on a course that all of our students take that at least begins to address that, and they've all had to read writings by all of you in that class. But we know we have a ways to go, but we know how important that is. But I want to finish with a reference to comments that began and concluded this conversation. Dr. Myers' story about the Salvation Army, and what was the one word? What was the one word? Others. And then the story that David Tribman finished with about the Hungarian emigre who was the president of our college, who said, each year, not am I my brother's keeper, but am I my brother's brother? And when you think about that, that's exactly what our mission statement is about. Developing competence with compassion, synthesizing faith with learning. So thank each one of you for such a profound conversation that you have shared with us on this day. Please know that it won't be a one-off experience for us. And any of you who are able, please join us for a reception to continue the conversation and some lunch in the Cosgrave meeting rooms. Thank you, one and all.